Hello and welcome to week 2 of the NPTEL MOOCs course on development research methods. In today's lesson, we will study about the paradigms of development research, or what has otherwise been also known as different worldviews or philosophical worldviews of development research. In standard research framework, we also refer to paradigms as theoretical constructs or conceptual frameworks, which is one of the first steps that we enter into before beginning academic research or development work research. So, what we will cover in today's lesson is as follows. We will first look at what are research paradigms and philosophical worldviews. We will then look at, are the different research paradigms in conflict with each other? Do research paradigm inform research methods, and if so, in what way? And what is the way forward from research paradigms? Now, by now we know that research can be defined as a systematic investigation or inquiry into a social phenomenon or a development project, whereby data are collected, analyzed and interpreted so as to inform the development problem that is being studied. Many scholars are of the opinion that it was relatively simple to define research 30 or 40 years ago than it is now. Defining research has become complex because of the dynamic ways in which research methods are increasing on a daily basis. And therefore, more often than not, the exact nature of definition of research is influenced by the researcher's theoretical or conceptual framework. So, a theory is used to establish relationships between or among constructs that describe or explain a phenomenon by going beyond the local event and trying to connect it with similar events. Now, this theoretical framework or conceptual framework is basically distinct from a theory and is sometimes referred to as a paradigm that influences the way knowledge is to be understood and the way knowledge is to be studied. It is the choice of paradigm that sets down the intent, motivation and expectations from the research. So, without nominating a paradigm as the first step, there is no basis for subsequent choices regarding methodology, methods, literatures or the research design that is being adopted for a study. Now, loosely put, the term paradigm may be defined as a collection of logically related assumptions, concepts or propositions that orient thinking and research, or the philosophical intent or motivation for undertaking the study. As I have already pointed out, paradigms are also referred to as philosophical worldviews, and the term worldview is basically set to mean a basic set of beliefs that guide action. Many people have also used other terminologies for paradigms. They refer it to as epistemologies and ontologies, or broadly conceived research methodologies. Worldviews as a general is also looked at as a general philosophical orientation about the world and the nature of research that a researcher belongs to a study. It is also noticed that worldviews arise based on discipline orientations, depending upon the discipline that the researcher comes from, whether the researcher comes from a basic orientation of economics or sociology or psychology. Worldviews also arise. It is largely influenced by students, advisors, mentors, inclinations and past research experiences. And the types of beliefs held by individual researchers based on these factors often lead to embracing a qualitative, quantitative or mixed methods approach in their research. Now, in the larger literature on development research and development studies, various kinds of worldviews or philosophical worldviews have been discussed. However, the four major worldviews which finds a pride of place in most research methodology literature are as follows: positivism or post-positivism, constructivism or interpretivism, transformative and pragmatism, and these are the four worldviews that we will focus on for our lesson today. Now, if we have to look in terms of a framework for research, we now know that there is an interconnection of worldviews, design and research methods. If you look at the diagram which is showing on your slide now, on the left we begin with philosophical worldviews first, and going by the four major worldviews that I have just highlighted. These worldviews inform the different kinds of research approaches that we might adopt for the research design that is being that we are trying to carry out. It also informs the various kinds of research methods based upon the research approaches that we have taken up. But you would see that the arrows go both ways, which means that after taking up the research methods based upon a philosophical worldview, often it happens that the analysis and the conclusions that we arrive at based upon the research approaches and the research methods also may go on to inform the philosophical worldview with which we began our research from. Now, let us look at all of these worldviews one after the other, beginning with the post-positivist worldview. Now, the post-positivist assumption have represented the traditional form of research, and these assumptions hold true more for quantitative research than qualitative research. And this worldview is sometimes called the scientific method or doing science research. It is also called positivist, post-positivist, empirical science, and post-positivism, and so on. This last term, post-positivism, is called so because it represents the thinking after positivism, challenging the traditional notion of the absolute truth of knowledge and recognizing that we cannot be positive about our claims of knowledge when studying the behavior and actions of humans. Post-positivists hold a very deterministic philosophy which says that the causes probably determine effects or outcomes such as found in experiments or quasi-experiments carried out in the form of quantitative methods. Post-positivists also feel that research is mostly reductionist in that the intent of research is to reduce ideas into a small discrete set to test, such as the variables that comprise hypothesis and research questions. The knowledge that develops through a post-positivist lens is based on careful observation and measurement of the objective reality that exists out there in the world. Thus, developing numeric measures of observations and studying the behavior of individuals becomes of paramount importance for positivists and the post-positivists. There are laws and theory. The positivists and the post-positivists feel that there are laws or theories that govern the world, and these laws and theories need to be tested or verified and refined so that we can understand the world better. So, in the scientific method, the accepted approach to research by post-positivists is that a researcher begins with a theory, they collect data that either supports or refutes the theory, and then they make necessary revisions and conduct additional tests. Now, there are some of the key assumptions of this post-positivist position, and that is a useful thing to keep in mind when looking at research guided by post-positivist worldview. These are some of the assumptions that are the basis of positivist worldview. First is the first assumption is that knowledge is conjectural. You can at best make conjectures. Another term which is used for this is called anti-foundational, which means that absolute truth can never be found. Thus, evidence established in research is always imperfect and infallible, and it is for this reason that researchers in following the positivist tradition do not go to reject a hypothesis outrightly, but they indicate a failure to reject the hypothesis. Therefore, knowledge is conjectural. The second assumption is that research is the process of making claims and then refining or abandoning some of them for other claims that are most strongly warranted. So, most quantitative research, for example, starts with the test of a theory or testing of a hypothesis. The third assumption is that data, evidence and rational consideration shape knowledge. In practice, the researcher collects information on instruments based on measures completed by the participants or based upon observations recorded by the researcher. The fourth assumption is that following the positivist, post-positivist tradition, it is said that research seeks to develop relevant true statements, ones that can serve to explain the situation of concern or that describe the causal relationship of interest. In quantitative studies, researchers advance the relationship among variables and pose this in terms of questions or hypotheses. And finally, the final assumption of the positivists is that being objective is an essential aspect of competitive inquiry. There is no scope for subjectivity. Therefore, the approach is highly objective. Researchers need to examine methods and come to conclusions without bias. For example, standard of validity and reliability are important in quantitative research methods, which rely upon the positivist and the post-positivist tradition. The constructivist worldview, the second worldview, or which is also referred to as interpretivism or the interpretivist worldview, stands in opposition to the positivist worldview. Constructivism or social constructivism, which is how it is often called, and combined with interpretivism, is a perspective which is typically seen as an approach to qualitative research. Social constructivists, they believe that individuals seek understanding of the world in which they live and work, and individuals develop subjective meaning of their experiences. Meanings are directed towards certain objects or things, and these meanings are varied and multiple, leading the researcher to look for the complexity of views rather than narrowing meanings into a few categories or indicators as done by the post-positivists following the quantitative tradition. So, the goal of research based upon social constructivists is to rely as much as possible on the participants' views of the situation being studied, and the questions then become broad and general, so that the participants can construct the meaning of a situation, typically forged in discussions or interactions with other persons. And the constructivists, interpretivists believe in having more open-ended questions, because I think the more open-ended the questioning, the better, as the researcher listens carefully to what people say or do in their life settings. And often these subjective meanings are negotiated socially and historically. They are not simply imprinted on individuals, but are formed through interaction with others, and hence interpretivism or constructivism, and through historical and cultural norms that operate in individuals' lives. So, constructivist researchers often address the process of interaction among individuals. They also focus on the specific contexts in which people live and work in order to understand the historical and cultural settings of the participants, and researchers recognize that their own backgrounds can also shape their interpretation of the research that is being undertaken, and therefore there is a weight placed on the insider view. Insider meaning the researcher who is conducting the research, their views also matter a lot with regard to the qualitative interpretation. So, the researcher position themselves in the research to acknowledge how their interpretation flows from their personal, cultural and historical experiences, and the researcher's intent is to make sense or interpret the meanings others have about the world. Rather than starting with a theory as in post-positivism, inquirers of social constructivist tradition generate or inductively develop a pattern or theory of pattern or providing a theory or pattern of meaning. Now, various scholars following the social constructivist view have also come up with several assumptions, and it is useful to look at some of the constructivist assumptions. They are as follows. The first is that human beings, the first assumption following the constructivist view is that human beings construct meanings as they engage with the world they are interpreting, and qualitative researchers tend to use open-ended questions so that the participants can share their views therefore. The second assumption is that humans engage with their world and make sense of it based on their historical and social perspectives. We are all born into a world of meaning bestowed upon us by our culture. So, the meanings that we attach to objects, the meaning that we attach to practices in our social surrounding is largely a function of the cultural setting within which we adapt ourselves to. Therefore, qualitative researchers seek to understand the context or setting of the participants through visiting this context and gathering information personally. They also interpret what they find, an interpretation shaped by the researcher's own experience and background. Thirdly, the basic generation of meaning as far as the social constructivist view is it is always social, arising in and out of interaction with a human community. Therefore, the process of qualitative research is largely inductive, and the inquirer generates meaning from the data collected in the field. Mostly in the field of academic research and development studies, we find quantitative purists and qualitative purists, and the ideas posited by the quantitative purists and the qualitative purists are usually always in conflict with each other, and therefore there are situations where it leads to paradigm wars or paradigm conflicts, and a lot of debate goes on with regard to the reliability and validity of the data emanating based upon positivist tradition and the social constructivist tradition. We will look at some of these conflicts and why these conflicts arise and how these conflicts have been dealt with by researchers in the recent times. in some time. The third worldview that finds a lot of mention in application oriented development research, particularly in the fields of development work and development studies, which look towards more of application in development projects, is the transformative worldview. It is also referred to as the advocacy and the participatory worldview. Now, these group of researchers, they hold to the philosophical assumptions of the transformative approach, and this position arose mostly during the 1980s and the 1990s from individuals who felt that the post-positivist assumptions imposed structural laws and theories that did not fit the marginalized individuals in our society because of issues of power and social justice, discrimination, oppression, and these issues needed to be addressed. Therefore, the overall theoretical frameworks provided by the social constructivists or the positivists approach did not fit into this into the notion of the marginalized peoples of the world. And interestingly, there is no uniform body of literature characterizing this worldview, this transformative worldview, but it includes groups of researchers that can be clubbed under the category of critical theorists. So, we are talking about participatory action researchers, Marxists, feminists, racial and ethnic minorities, persons with disabilities, indigenous and post-colonial peoples, and members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual and queer communities. It is also important to note here that a transformative worldview holds that research inquiry needs to be intertwined with politics and a political change agenda to confront social oppression at whatever level it occurs. So, the research contains an action agenda for reform that may change lives of the participants, the institutions in which individuals work or live, and the researcher's life. Specific issues need to be addressed that speak to important social issues of the day, issues such as empowerment, inequality, oppression, suppression, domination, alienation, and so on. So, the researcher often begins with one of these issues as the focal point of study when adapting the transformative approach. The research also assumes that the inquirer will proceed collaboratively with the participants so as not to alienate or marginalize the participants further as a result of the inquiry. In this sense, the participants may help design questions. By participants here, we mean the subjects that are being studied become collaborators in research, and after undergoing periods of immersion in the field, the participants themselves inform the researcher regarding the research questions or the research problem that needs to be studied to collect data, analyze information, or reap the rewards of the research. So, transformative research provides a voice for these participants, raising their consciousness or advancing an agenda for change to improve their lives, and it becomes a united voice for reform and change. To give an example of transformative research, various forms of development practice research that takes place on the field follows the transformative research worldview. For example, a researcher goes to the field to collect information about gender division of labor with regard to collection of water in a certain rural area. And so, in this case, instead of having a notion of the researcher already having a notion of how the participants behave with regard to this notion of gender division of labor with regard to water collection, the researcher goes to the field, immerses herself in the field with the participants, and the participants here are the people themselves who undergo the task of collecting water. And then here the researcher and the researched become collaborators, and they interact with each other, and the research problem is highlighted by the researched as to saying so therefore, the research problems are highlighted by the researched, and then through the process of interaction some kind of an agenda of change is also designed by the collaborators themselves. So, this philosophical worldview, the transformative worldview, focuses on the needs of groups and individuals in a society that may be marginalized or disenfranchised. Therefore, theoretical perspectives may be integrated with the philosophical assumptions that construct a picture of the issues being examined, the people to be studied, and the changes that are needed, such as feminist perspectives, racialized discourses, critical theory, and so on. So, what does the transformative paradigm focus on? If we have to summarize some of the important focus areas of the transformative paradigms, they are as follows. Number one, it places central importance on the study of lives and experiences of diverse groups that have traditionally been marginalized. Of special interest for these diverse groups is how their lives have been constrained by the oppressors and the strategies they use to resist, challenge, and subvert these constraints. Second of all, in studying these diverse groups, the research focuses on inequities based on gender, race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic classes that result in asymmetric power relationships. The research in the transformative worldview definitely links political and social action to these inequities, and transformative research uses a program theory of beliefs about how a program works and why the problems of oppression, domination, and power relationships exist. Therefore, the transformative worldview ultimately leads towards some kind of an action agenda, or it decides upon an action agenda within the research framework, such that by the end of the research project some amount of transformation has already taken place. The final worldview that needs discussion is the pragmatic worldview, and this is also a philosophy or a philosophy which informs development research methods in its practice oriented forms. And this worldview comes from groups of researchers who call themselves as pragmatists. Pragmatism, and there are many forms of this philosophy, but for many, pragmatism as a worldview arises out of actions, situations, and consequences rather than antecedent conditions, as in the case of post-positivism or the post-positivists. There is a concern with applications with regard to what works and what solutions to arrive at. Instead of focusing on methods, researchers following the pragmatism viewpoint focus on the research problem rather than on a theoretical construct or a conceptual framework. So, they come up with various approaches available to understand the research problem first. So, in that sense, pragmatism is not committed to any one system of philosophy and reality, and this applies to mixed methods research in that, and therefore they do not stick themselves to either the quantitative purists or the qualitative purists, because depending upon the research problem at hand, they decide whether they want to take up quantitative research methods or qualitative research methods, or mix both of these research methods concurrently or sequentially. So, this applies to mixed methods research in that inquirers draw liberally from both quantitative and qualitative assumptions when they engage in these kinds of research. The second point is that individual researchers following the pragmatism worldview have a freedom of choice. So, researchers are free to choose the methods, techniques, and procedures of research and that best meet their needs and purposes. Thirdly, pragmatists do not see the world as one absolute unity. In a similar way, mixed methods researchers also look to many approaches for collecting and analyzing data rather than subscribing to only one way, that is the quantitative way or the qualitative way. They are open to looking up various forms of methods of analysis to arrive at the research problem that is being studied. The pragmatists also, the researchers look to what and how to research based on the intended consequences, where they want to go with it, and mixed methods researchers need to establish a purpose for their mixing, a rationale for the reasons why quantitative and qualitative data need to be mixed in the first place. Pragmatists also agree that research always occurs in social, historical, political, and other contexts, and they believe in an external world independent of the mind as well as that lodged in the mind. So, this is a summary view of all the four worldviews that we have just studied: the post-positivists, constructivists, transformative, and pragmatists. So, in a nutshell, the post-positivists or positivists are seeking the objective reality. So, therefore, their focus is on determination, reductionism, empirical observation and measurement, theory verification. Constructivists focus on understanding, multiple participant meanings, social and historical construction, theory generation. Transformatives focus they focus more on political and social realities, power and justice oriented systems, They believe in collaborative research between the researcher and the researched, and they have a change oriented agenda, or there is an action agenda in the research, in the transformative paradigm that they are taking up. Pragmatism as a paradigm focuses more on problems, it is more problem centered, and therefore focuses a lot on the consequences of the actions. The different kinds of research methods that are adopted by the pragmatists are pluralistic in nature, and it is a real world practice oriented form of worldview. So, within the larger domain of development studies and development work research, positivists and constructivists adhere or cater more to the needs of the academics or academicians, whereas the transformative and pragmatists focus more towards the needs of development practitioners. However, when we are looking at more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary ways of doing research, all of these we have moved to a place in research methods where different worldviews are also sort of getting are being used collaboratively and combined to come up with better results. Now, given that there are these four broad worldviews that are considered for development research, there is a certain language which also gets commonly associated with these major research paradigms, and the language that gets associated with these research paradigms mostly follows the research methods framework. So, for example, in the positivist or the post-positivist paradigm, the language used is that of experimental, quasi-experimental, correlational, reductionism, theory verification, causal comparative, determination, and so on. So, which means that it is more quantitative, it moves more towards the quantitative axis. Interpretivist, constructivist language follows naturalistic, phenomenological, hermeneutics, ethnographic, multiple participant meaning, social and historical construction, theory generation, and so on. The language used by the transformatives leans towards critical theory, neo-Marxist, feminists, critical race theory, participatory, emancipatory, advocacy, grand narratives, empowerment issue oriented, change oriented, and so on. Pragmatists language which is commonly associated is consequences of action, problem centered, pluralistic, mixed methods, models of doing research, real world practice oriented. Now, these language that commonly associated with these research paradigms has been worked upon by various scholars taking from the research materials that are coming up, and this language association with different research paradigms is based upon a systematic review of literature carried out by various scholars, which I have shown on the slide here. The research paradigms also inform the methods and the tools, and I have already made an indication to this in the earlier slides. This is a neater tabulation of how the paradigms inform the methods and the tools. So, positivists methods is quantitative. They also use some qualitative methods within the paradigm, but the most dominant methods are quantitative methods, and the data collection tools examples are experiments, quasi-experiments, tests, and scales. Interpretivists largely use qualitative methods, however, they may also use some quantitative methods, and the data collection tools are interviews, observations, document reviews, visual data analysis. Transformatives use a combination of both qualitative and quantitative or mixed methods, and they have a diverse range of tools. They particularly need to avoid discrimination when they are conducting research, for example, that of sexism, racism, and homophobia. Pragmatists methods, they follow the methods of qualitative or quantitative methods, again mixed methods, and their methods are matched to the specific questions and purpose of the research, and they also may include tools from both positivist and interpretivist paradigms, example interviews, observations, and testing and experiment. The thing to remember about the pragmatists is that the pragmatists inform philosophy rather than starting from a philosophical worldview, which is why they start from a problem and then see whether after the using of methods and coming up with solutions of the problem, the entire research can inform can provide a philosophical worldview to further research. Now, let us come to the conflicts between different paradigms. I have already made a mention about quantitative purists and qualitative purists, and that there are often conflicts between these different paradigms with regard to the types of research that is being carried out, the conclusions that is arrived at, and the interpretations that we give to these different kinds of research. And often, very often we find that the interpretations provided to the conclusions that we are arriving at give a very different understanding or a different worldview of how things happen, of how social phenomena are occurring. And this leads to paradigm, and therefore there is an existence of paradigm wars, and many groups of researchers such as the action oriented researchers or the transformative groups and the pragmatic groups have therefore moved from the puritanism of the quantitative theorists and qualitative theorists and more towards mixed methods. So, paradigm wars emerged mostly in the social sciences and behavioral sciences. There are models that are imitated within any given field, and competing paradigms exist simultaneously. Debates about qualitative and quantitative research have roots in the mid 19th century, and they occurred mostly in sociology in the 1920s and 1930s. And recent attention to the debate started with a revival of qualitative research methods in the 1960s in sociology and psychology. And if you look at the research of the 1940s and 1950s, sociology and psychology was largely dominated by quantitative methods, that is survey or experiment, and positive paradigm underlines quantitative methods, while the constructivist paradigm underlines qualitative methods, also called qualitative quantitative debate. And paradigm wars concern important conceptual issues such as the nature of reality or the possibility of causal linkages, whether the association that are being seen as part of a development problem that is being studied, whether there is a causal relationship between the determinants that we are seeing, or it is simply an association, and how does one reach at an interpretation of such realities. So, let us have a brief look at why the war of paradigms arose and what is the stance of the quantitative purists and the qualitative purists. So, there are purists on both sides, on quantitative and qualitative, and as I have already mentioned, quantitative purists articulate assumptions consistent with the positivist philosophy or the post-positivist philosophy. Some of the major characteristics are as follows. They believe that social observations should be treated as entities in much the same way as physical scientists treat physical phenomena, and the observer is separate from the entities that are subject to observation. Therefore, there is an objective reality which is being inquired into or investigated into with respect to quantitative methods. Social science, therefore, they say that social science inquiry should be objective like the natural sciences. In other words, time and context free generalizations are desirable and it is possible. And these time and context free generalizations will lead to elimination of biases, and therefore, there is a need to remain emotionally detached and uninvolved with the objects of the study. So, for example, quantitative purists might not like a person belonging to a certain ethnicity to go back to his or her own ethnic group and carry out a study, because they believe that will bring in a lot of biases into the study, and there is a need to keep his or her own biases away to be able to study the problem of the ethnic group more meaningfully. And the quantitative purists emphasize on tests or empirically justified stated hypothesis. They believe in rhetorical neutrality involving a formal writing style using the impersonal passive voice and technical terminology, in which establishing and describing social laws is the major focus. Many research work carried out by psychologists and economists, mainstream psychologists and mainstream economists mostly fall under the quantitative purists positivist philosophy framework. The qualitative purists reject positivism because they believe that there are multiple constructed realities in the society. Given the subjects that we are studying, the participants that we are studying, there cannot be an objective reality, because reality is subjective and there are multiple constructed realities. They believe that time and context free generalizations are neither desirable nor possible, and research is value bound. It is impossible to differentiate fully cause and effects, and therefore, they look down upon the various kinds of positivist tools and techniques for carrying out research on social phenomena such as regression analysis. They believe that logic flows from specific to general, and therefore, their explanations are generated inductively from the data. They also believe that the knower and the known cannot be separated, because the subjective knower is the only source of reality, and there is a dislike for detached and passive style of writing, preferring instead detailed, rich and thick description written directly and somewhat informally. Let us summarize some of the strengths and weaknesses of quantitative research following the positivist tradition, and similarly the strengths and weaknesses of qualitative research following the social constructivist tradition. So, what are the strengths of quantitative research? First is the testing and validity already constructed theories about how and to a lesser degree why the phenomena occur. Testing hypotheses that are constructed before the data are collected, they can lead to generalization of the research findings when the data are based on random samples of sufficient size. So, we can get the big picture depending upon the generalizations that are arrived at by quantitative research. The researcher may construct a situation that eliminates the confounding influence of many variables, allowing one to more credibly assess cause and effect relationships. So, for example, if one is studying the issue of malnourishment in a certain community, and if certain socio-economic determinants can be highlighted. So, let us say for example, maternal education seems to have a positive correlation to nutrition outcomes, then we can with a lot of reliability and validation say that inform public policy that probably if the resources are gathered more towards improving maternal education, we can have better nutrition outcomes. So, that is one of the advantages of carrying out the quantitative research following the positivist tradition. Relatively quick data collection methods and one that can provide precise numerical data analysis which is relatively less time consuming. Quantitative research methods, because it is based upon data, can lead to removal of biases and provide research findings at a relatively lesser period of time. It may have higher credibility with many people in power, example administrators, politicians, people who fund programs, etc. The weaknesses are as follows: the researchers' categories or theories that are used may not reflect local constituencies' understanding. Usually we follow generic categories when we are carrying out quantitative research analysis, and that may not represent the local view given the cultural and the social context in which this research has been carried out. Similarly, researchers may miss out on phenomena occurring because of the focus on theory or hypothesis testing rather than on theory or hypothesis generation, called the confirmation bias, and this is a very common bias or error that comes up in the case of quantitative research, because the focus on generalization is so much that the context loses or the context gets hidden when we are interpreting the results. Similarly, knowledge produced may be too abstract and general for direct application to specific local situation, contexts and individuals. The qualitative strengths and weaknesses are as follows. One, strengths are of course that the data are based on participants' own categories of meaning, and when the data is based on participants' own categories of meaning, interventions becomes much more meaningful. It informs public policies better with regard to where to intervene and how to intervene. It is useful for studying a limited number of cases in depth. It is useful for describing a complex phenomena, and it provides individual case information. It also provides understanding and description of people's personal experiences of phenomena, and the researcher can study dynamic processes. The researcher can also use the primarily qualitative method of grounded theory to generate inductively a tentative but explanatory theory about a phenomenon. So, meaning to say that qualitative theorists can come up with a more in-depth understanding of the limited case analysis that are being carried out. The weaknesses are basically the positives of the positivist tradition or the quantitative methods. They lack generalizations. Generalizability becomes a problem with qualitative analysis. It may have lower credibility with administrators and commissioners of programs because we do not get the big picture, and data analysis is often time consuming because looking at people's interviews and being able to come up with a proper analysis based upon the narratives takes a lot of time. Now, as a consequence of the paradigm wars emerging from the conflicts of the quantitative purists and the qualitative purists, or the war of paradigms, there are a group of pacifists who state that qualitative and quantitative methods, instead of being contradictory to each other, can actually be highly compatible. So, they have pointed out that in education and evaluation research, authors have presented the compatibility thesis based on a different paradigm called pragmatism. So, pragmatism or pragmatist worldview or pragmatism as a philosophical worldview provides the middle path for quantitative and qualitative purists. Most researchers now use whatever method is appropriate for their studies, and pragmatically oriented theorists and researchers often refer to mixed methods which contain elements of both the quantitative and qualitative approaches. And pragmatist orientation has superseded the paradigm wars. Therefore, instead of focusing a lot on theoretical constructs or conceptual frameworks, you begin studying a research problem and then expand the research problem further by understanding what are the different kinds of tools that are available and that can be used to study the problem further. The usage of generic terms such as mixed methods connote several different ways of conducting a study or a series of study. So, mixed up models or mixed method models derives from the lack of a worldview, paradigm or theory for mixed model studies. So, let us come, we have come to the end of today's lesson. What we have looked at so far now is that there are 4 different world views that are usually that we usually depend upon to care for research in the field of development studies and development work. So, we began with the positivists or the post-positivists, moving on to the social constructivists or the interpretivists, the transformative worldview and the pragmatist worldview. On the one hand, we have paradigm wars between the quantitative and qualitative purists, and on the other hand, we have middle path being forged by the transformative worldview and the pragmatists worldview. But how do we go from there on? After we know that there is a worldview that we need to follow, how does that define the different steps of research in the entire research design? Research projects rarely ever follow a neat linear path, but the steps and decisions made by the researcher may look something like this. I have shown this in the form of a flow chart here. So, basically we begin with step 1, which we start with a broad notion of the discipline and of the paradigm we see as suiting our research. So, we follow either the positivist, transformative, pragmatic or interpretivist paradigm. In steps 2, 3 and 4 can be carried out one after the other, in which first we determine the area of investigation, we identify the approach. For example, whether we want to have for example, we are again taking the example of undernourishment or nutrition, whether we want to take a historical, descriptive, feminist, developmental, case study, field study, correlational, causal, comparative, experimental or action. What is the approach that we want to study? If we are taking a positivist paradigm, then we may take a causal comparative approach. If we want to take up a transformative paradigm, we may take a feminist approach. If we want to have a interpretivist, constructivist paradigm, the approach to take may be highly descriptive. Similarly, if we take a pragmatic approach, we can have a mix of different kinds of, we can have a causal comparative study, experimental study, we can also have a case study approach to understand the problem better. Based upon the paradigm that we have chosen and the approaches that we have chosen, we can then conduct literature review. There will be one class entirely devoted to literature review on development research methods, but in this step we understand the research problem further by defining it better. We refine it in the research question, and the issues that we want to take up is also refined in light of the literature. In step 5, we decide, after having understood the paradigms and the approaches and the research questions that have been taken up, we determine at step 5 whether we want to take either purely quantitative methods, qualitative methods, or we want to mix both of these methods. And based upon the decision that we are taking in step 5, we decide in step 6 regarding the kind of study that we want to take up, whether we want to take up surveys, we want to do hypothesis testing based upon a mathematical model or a statistical model based upon secondary data, whether we want to conduct structured or semi-structured interviews, we want to carry out various kinds of experiments based upon survey data, whether we want to do a document analysis, we want to carry out more participant observations, focus group discussions and so on. In step 5, depending upon the kind of paradigm and the research methods that we have taken up, we decide on the timeline, we develop or identify the data collection tools, we refine the data collection tools, determine who will collect data. So, whether the data has to be collected by the researcher herself, or there has to be we involve a number of field enumerators, or whether we need to collect data from, if we are collecting secondary data sources, then whether we want to depend upon archival research or we want to depend upon government records and so on. We trial the data collection tools. We also determine the step 8 is obtaining the ethics approval for determining the type of research and where are the data coming from, whether it is approved by the ethics committee of the agency which is carrying out the research. Then we look at data collection and then analyzing the data, and the final step is about writing up the findings and conclusions. And it is always advisable that before we write up the findings and conclusions of the final discussions, we return to the literature prior to step 11. So, we go back to step 4 before we come to the final step on step 11 for writing of the research. These are the references that have been used for this lesson. For a comprehensive literature on the topics covered in this lecture, I also suggest that the students can go through the reference list of these cited papers. They are easily available online, and some of the books mentioned here are also available online. In the next class, we will be studying the development research, development work continuum, and we will go into some details about the action research methodologies and what is the philosophical worldview of action research, which I have already mentioned as a transformative worldview, but what are the individual components of action research methods that can inform research and policy action. See you in the next class. Thank you.